Thanks, John, and good morning. Welcome to West Michigan's Morning News on News Radio Wood 1300 and 106.9 FM. Ed Vanderplug in for Steve Kelly this morning. Brett Paquita is here along with Brian Fongers, who is our producer extraordinaire. And on our live line this morning, we're joined by Jim Whiddon, the author of The Old School Advantage, Timeless Tools for Every Generation. And Jim, according to some research conducted by CareerBuilder.com, 85% of employers say that they've busted job applicants who've lied on their resume, and that's up from 66% just 5 years ago. Is what I'll call resume fraud that prevalent in the job-seeking sectors?
Good morning. It's good to be with you. I think, unfortunately, it is. 85% have found them. I kind of think the other 15% just have not looked. And I think a lot of times they're just, frankly, they get to a point in an interview process. If you think about it, they've been probably through a phone interview, or a couple of them. They've been online, maybe even a Skype interview. So by the time they get to a personal interview, they're impressed. Otherwise, you wouldn't be there. And I think sometimes they don't want to check. They don't want to find an answer that they don't like. So they just continue to move through the process. But there's no question it's more prevalent now.
Jim, do you have any idea, I don't know how deep this research went, of what exactly was like the biggest area of infraction as far as the line? Was it whether they had a degree, whether they had a master's, or just simply, they put on there a place of business that they worked, or whatever the case may be, and that wasn't the case?
There were two areas in particular. One was the degrees, the college degrees, and this one makes sense, too, when you consider that only 56% of students that start in college end up with a degree. But the other one was the gaps. In other words, there were gaps in their resume where there should have been some work experience, but there wasn't, which could indicate that it was a bad experience and or they don't want a recommendation from that particular employees. So those are probably the two biggest areas. It's interesting. This goes all the way to the top. Recent article mentioned the MIT dean, I believe, the CEO of Yahoo. They were there for several years before resume errors or omissions, I should say, were found on their resume. And even, you may recall, George O'Leary, the head football coach, for a week at Notre Dame University back in, I think it was in 2001 or so. So it's incredible to think that it goes all the way to the top positions. It's not just the entry-level positions.
Jim, what happens in, let's say, a human resources position, the portion of a corporation that's typically recruiting to fill open positions? Is it just a tendency to want to stop at a certain point in time in doing their due diligence and background searches on job candidates, or do you find that higher up the corporate ladder that when somebody may impress through an interview or other communications that they become sort of sold on the candidate, and there's a pressure to the human resources department, well, this candidate looks good, we're going to go with this person before dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's, so to speak?
Well, that's a great question. You think about just human relations and human foibles. The higher the position, often an HR director might be interviewing for a position that's higher than their own. It would be pretty embarrassing to kind of stop the process there and ask questions that might put somebody on the spot. So, yes, the more important the position in the organization, the less likely they are, ironically, especially after citing those upper echelon mistakes that were made. There's a tendency not to want to go there, so to speak, in the conversation. But, why would, I think another important question to ask is, why would a prospective employee do this? It's such short-term thinking, because in the long term, you're going to be found out. It's almost like that proverbial nightmare that if you've been to college, we've all had, and that is, we don't go to class the entire semester, and then we think we're going to show up and pass the final exam. But the entire semester we're walking on eggshells. This is what I can imagine it is like if you've obtained a position in an organization under false pretensions.
Jim Whiddon, thanks for joining us this morning on West Michigan's Morning News. We thank you for your insights in this topic, and we look forward to speaking with you again. Have a great week.
It's my pleasure. You do the same.
Thank you. Wood Radio.
Resume fraud. Apparently, it's a pretty big thing. In fact, according to Career Builder, 85% of employers have busted job applicants lying on their resume. That's up from 66% 5 years ago. Joining us on the Kogo News Live line is author of The Old School Advantage, Timeless Tools for Every Generation, Jim Whiddon. Good morning, Jim.
Hi, Ted. Good morning. How are you?
Very good, thank you, sir. So what kind of resume lies are we talking about? Little white lies or big old whoppers?
Both. The whoppers, the big lie is actually easier to believe because people think you won't do it. And so the big lie of the degree they don't have is probably the most prevalent. It's the one that gets the most press. It goes all the way to the top also. You see the dean at MIT, the CEO at Yahoo, the head football coach at Notre Dame back in 2001. And so the big one is out there, but also little ones. And probably the most prevalent little one, and I put that in quotes, is the employment gaps. In other words, people will kind of erase over a gap in employment, maybe a year and a half or two, where it didn't go so well, or they feel like that employer might not give them a great recommendation if they're called. And so they'll just omit that on their resume. So that maybe could be qualified as one of the little lies.
So why do people think they can make up their history?
It's crazy, especially in the technology age we live in. You would think they'd understand that the information is out there and it's cheap. The internet has been democratized, so to speak. And so that's a good question. I think they're just thinking short term. They're not thinking long term. They don't understand that these things catch up with you. On the employer side, you mentioned 85% have found it. I think the other 15% just aren't looking. But it's just astounding that this happens in this day and age. It's like, and if you're the employee doing this, think about this. It's like the proverbial nightmare of not going to class and then expecting to show up for the final. Well, one day that final is going to be passed out. It may not be for years until you're interviewing for the next promotion, but eventually it will catch up with you.
So there are a lot of, and I'm reading a synopsis here, there are a lot of big name people who have been caught in a lie, especially about their education.
And no question. I mentioned George O'Leary. He got to the pinnacle of the college football world at Notre Dame University, and within a week they did a check. Now, of course, they had egg on their face. Why they didn't check before, I don't know. But yeah, there you go. And I mentioned the dean at MIT, the CEO of Yahoo, after several years, I think it was 7 or 8 years in one or both of those cases. We tell employers across the country, you've got to recruit character first. Skills and techniques can be taught. Character is caught. And what we mean by that is over decades, character is developed. Warren Buffett even weighed in on this recently. Here's a quote from him. He says, quote, somebody once said that in looking for people to hire, you look for 3 qualities: integrity, intelligence, and energy. And if they don't have that first one, integrity, the other 2 are going to kill you. In other words, he says, no matter how gifted we are, without character, everything eventually falls apart. So both sides of the equation need to understand that, employer and the person being recruited.
What if you're in a job right now that you lied to get? Should you just shut up?
It depends on what that lie was. If it was the gap in employment history, I'm not sure that's going to be as big a deal. If it was a degree, wow. That's tough. I think, there's nothing wrong with showing that you made a mistake. In fact, ironically, a lot of times, when you fess up to a mistake, people think more of you after that than they did before they even knew about the mistake. So certainly it would be on a case-by-case basis. But, hey, we just had 4th of July. Ben Franklin was a big part of that independence movement 241 years ago, and you know what he said? Honesty is the best policy. So.
And we'll leave it with that, Jim. Thank you so much. That is Jim Whiddon, author of The Old School Advantage, Timeless Tools for Every Generation. Kogo News Time, 646.